The story of Glenn G. Filkins begins in the dim, unrelenting corridors of the federal prison system during one of the most violent eras in its history. By the late 1980s, the penitentiaries of the United States were pressure cookers, sealed environments bursting with racial divisions, underground economies, and gangs that acted like shadow governments. Among them, the Aryan Brotherhood stood out as something far more deadly than an ordinary prison crew. It was a structured, militant criminal enterprise carved from white supremacist ideology and hardened by decades of bloodshed. To understand Filkins is to understand the world he stepped into. A prison landscape where respect was earned through fear, loyalty through violence, and membership through murder. Long before Filkins carried out the act that cemented his place inside the Brotherhood, he was another inmate navigating the rhythms of confinement, learning who controlled which yard, which tables to avoid, and how the hidden currents of gang politics shaped every breath he took. The Aryan Brotherhood had watched him, evaluated him, tested him in the way they tested all potential recruits. In a system where weakness was a liability and strength was currency, Filkins had demonstrated both capability and willingness. Recruits weren't chosen based on ideology alone. They were chosen because they had value, because they could be shaped into tools, soldiers, and executioners. For Filkins, the turning point came when the Brotherhood's leadership determined it was time for him to prove he was more than just a useful inmate. The AB required something more binding, more permanent than verbal loyalty. They required what they famously called blood in, a murder committed in the service of the gang, a life taken to mark the final step into full membership. The order wasn't given impulsively. The AB operated on a hierarchical structure in which the Commission, its small governing council, authorized major decisions. During this period, the Commission's authority often passed through figures like Barry the Baron, Mills, and Tyler the Hulk Bingham, men feared throughout the federal system for orchestrating violence with bureaucratic precision. Below them were trusted lieutenants such as Phil Myers, who managed day-to-day operations and relayed decisions down the chain. When the Commission chose a target, it wasn't simply an execution. It was a strategic message, an announcement of dominance and control. The man marked for death was Arva Ray, an inmate whose alleged disrespect toward the Brotherhood could not go unanswered. In the universe of the Aryan Brotherhood, disrespect was more than an insult. It was a challenge to the gang's authority. If it wasn't crushed instantly and brutally, their entire reputation could be undermined. Reputation, after all, was the AB's most important weapon. They didn't control prisons through numbers. They were vastly outnumbered by rival groups. They controlled them through fear by guaranteeing that any slight, any threat, any dissent would be met with swift and merciless retaliation. Filkins understood the stakes when the order came down. Declining wasn't an option. Failure wasn't an option. His entire future inside the system, perhaps his survival, depended on carrying out the murder exactly as instructed. To be chosen for such a task was both an honor and a burden. It meant the leaders believed he was capable. It also meant he was now committed to a path stained with blood. USP Lompoc, the prison where the murder would take place, was a facility with its own internal hierarchies and tensions simmering beneath the surface. Inmates moved through routines that seemed mundane to outsiders. Meals, recreation, work assignments, but woven through all of it was the omnipresent reality of gang politics. Every step Filkins took in the yard, every conversation he had in the cell block, was shadowed by the decision that awaited him. He was preparing to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, and the Brotherhood was watching closely. What made the AB so effective during this era was the way they blended covert communication with ruthless discipline. Orders could travel across multiple institutions through coded letters, hand signals, or intermediaries. Despite the constant surveillance of correctional officers, the gang always found ways to execute its will. For Filkins, that meant months of subtle preparation, quiet conversations, and coordination with Thomas Miller, the inmate who would assist him. Miller wasn't just a partner by chance. The AB deliberately paired men who complemented each other, one to hold down the target, the other to carry out the kill. Filkins was the designated executioner. The weight of the assignment pressed on Filkins as the day approached. There is no glamour in a prison killing, only cold calculation. The Brotherhood expected precision. A mistake could expose the entire organization, or worse, weaken the myth of invincibility they had crafted over decades. So Filkins studied Ray's routines, observed his vulnerabilities, and mentally rehearsed the act he would perform. Every prison murder is, in a sense, a ritual. It is the moment where ideology, loyalty, and brutality intersect. For the Brotherhood, it was as much a ceremonial requirement as it was a practical enforcement of power. In the final days before the hit, Filkins entered a psychological state common among men preparing to cross into full gang membership. It was a mix of focus, adrenaline, fear, and indoctrination. The AB didn't simply tell him to kill. They told him that the killing would make him something greater, something permanent. They promised him the shamrock, the Brotherhood's emblem, worn by members like a badge of honor. These rings, carved in prison dental labs, were symbols of belonging, status, and identity. For many AB members, the ring meant more than freedom, more than family, more than life itself. It meant they were part of an elite order forged in violence. By the time the sun rose on August 9th, 1989, the stage was set. Arva Ray was going about his morning unaware that the AB had marked him for death. Filkins and Miller were ready to act, ready to fulfill the order handed down from the highest levels of the Brotherhood. What would follow would not only change the course of Filkins' life, but also become a defining event in the federal government's decades-long struggle to dismantle the Aryan Brotherhood. The decision to kill Arva Ray did not emerge from a moment of rage or a spontaneous altercation. It came from the highest strata of the Aryan Brotherhood's internal government, an institution as organized and deliberate as any criminal syndicate on the streets. Inside the walls of the federal penitentiary system, the AB's three-man commission functioned like a board of directors, reviewing disputes, authorizing killings, and shaping the direction of the gang across multiple states. This murder was one such directive, sanctioned after a series of communications between leadership and intermediaries like Phil Myers, a trusted orchestrator who specialized in handling matters too sensitive for ordinary members. For Glenn G. Filkins, the order that trickled down was clear, unambiguous, and absolute. Arva Ray had to die. To the Brotherhood, Ray's offense was not simply a violation of etiquette, but an existential challenge. Prison gangs survive not because they have numbers, but because they control the narrative of fear. If an inmate, any inmate, was allowed to disrespect them without consequence, that crack in their image could widen into something uncontrollable. Rumors travel faster than knives behind the walls, and the AB knew that failing to respond with decisive brutality would invite further challenges. Ray, whether he understood it or not, had become a symbol. He was the example the Brotherhood needed to make. The commission didn't just order a killing. It ordered the preservation of its authority. Filkins heard the rationale not in dramatic speeches, but in quiet, clipped conversations conducted in corners of the yard and coded notes passed hand to hand. The AB rarely raised its voice. It didn't have to. Its authority was felt in the silence that followed its decisions, in the nods exchanged by men who understood what was coming. For Filkins, being selected was both a burden and an acknowledgement. Only trusted recruits received assignments of this magnitude. He was no longer on the periphery of the gang's orbit. He was in the inner trajectory, where expectations were high and failure was fatal. The preparation began long before August 9th. Filkins and Thomas Miller studied Ray's daily habits with the patience of hunters tracking prey. Every movement mattered. What time Ray returned from the yard, how long he spent in the common areas, whether he talked to correctional officers, where he seemed most vulnerable. In a world where weapons could be improvised from toothbrushes, paper clips, or gym equipment, even the simplest detail could determine the success of a hit. The Brotherhood demanded intelligence as much as aggression. They wanted their killers to work with the precision of surgeons. The method was settled early in the planning stage: a heroin overdose. In prison, drugs were more than contraband. They were tools, leverage, and occasional weapons. Heroin could silence a man without bloodshed, without a struggle, and without drawing immediate suspicion. If executed properly, the killing could be passed off as an accidental overdose, a tragedy in a place overflowing with them. Filkins and Miller were instructed to administer the dose, monitor Ray, and ensure the death looked natural. But the AB always planned for contingencies. If the overdose failed, the kill would proceed through more direct means. The Brotherhood did not accept loose ends. Filkins understood this dual responsibility. He was the one designated to bring finality to the operation. Miller's role was to assist, restrain, and ensure Ray couldn't fight back in those crucial seconds when survival instincts kick in. In the AB's internal lexicon, Miller was the holder, Filkins the doer. It was a pairing designed to reduce risk. Every move was orchestrated with a sense of inevitability that mirrored the AB's entire philosophy. The outcome had already been decided. Now they were merely enacting it. During these days, the tension inside USP Lompoc simmered beneath the surface. Gang lookouts monitored correctional officer routines. Messages moved between cells like faint electrical signals running through hidden wires. Nothing about the prison looked different on the outside. But Filkins could feel the weight of unseen machinery grinding into motion around him. The Brotherhood had set the gears in place, and he was one of the cogs ensuring the machine ran smoothly. One of the most striking aspects of the AB's structure was its ability to enforce discipline and secrecy even under constant surveillance. Meetings were held in recreation areas disguised as casual conversations about sports or commissary items. Codes were woven into harmless-sounding phrases. The Commission's authority traveled through multiple hands without ever losing its clarity. This was how prison gangs survived for decades, even as federal authorities increased monitoring, wiretaps, and undercover operations. To an outsider, Filkins' preparations might have looked like typical inmate behavior. To those who knew, every gesture carried meaning. As the day of the hit approached, Filkins entered a psychological shift familiar to men about to commit life-altering violence. His world narrowed. The noise of the prison receded. He focused on the steps ahead. Get close to Ray, administer the heroin, wait for it to take effect. If necessary, finish the job with the garrote wire that had already been quietly smuggled, hidden, and prepared. There was no room for hesitation. The AB demanded absolute resolve, and Filkins had spent months proving he possessed it. On the night before the planned killing, a stillness settled over USP Lompoc that Filkins remembered even years later. It wasn't the physical silence of a quiet tear. It was the mental silence of a man who has accepted what he is about to do. He had crossed the emotional threshold. The Brotherhood had provided the motive. The Commission had provided the authority. Now he would provide the act, and when it was done, he would no longer be a recruit waiting to prove himself. He would be a member, sealed in blood. Filkins went to sleep that night, knowing that the next morning would define not only his standing within the Aryan Brotherhood, but the direction of the rest of his life. The countdown had begun, and there was no turning back. On the morning of August 9th, 1989, USP Lompoc looked the same as it always did. Gray walls, metal railings, the echo of gates clanging open and shut, and the rhythmic hum of inmates shuffling through routines they had memorized down to the breath. But for Glenn G. Filkins, nothing about this day felt ordinary. He woke up with the full weight of the Aryan Brotherhood bearing down on his shoulders. This was the day the Brotherhood expected him to prove himself. The day he would either ascend into full membership or fail in a way that could cost him his life. As he stepped into the corridors, every movement felt heavy, deliberate, charged with grim purpose. Filkins and Thomas Miller didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. Their roles had been rehearsed in silence, through glances and gestures shaped by months of preparation. They blended into the flow of inmates heading to their work details and daily tasks, moving naturally so as not to draw attention. But beneath the calm exterior, their minds were fixed on a single objective: get close to Arva Ray and carry out the hit exactly as ordered. The heroin had been smuggled into place days earlier, hidden in a way that only the AB could orchestrate under the watchful eyes of correctional staff. Ray moved about the unit with no idea that death was already stalking him. He went about his typical routine, small talk with familiar faces, moments of quiet reflection, the small acts that break up the monotony of prison life. To him, this was just another day. To Filkins and Miller, it was the culmination of a mandate handed down by one of the deadliest prison organizations in American history. It was the kind of assignment that changed men, the kind that branded them with a permanent identity. There was no ceremony, no whispered final warning given to Ray. The Aryan Brotherhood didn't offer its targets the dignity of foreshadowing. They struck without theatrics, just efficiency. The first phase of the plan was simple: administer the heroin and let the drug do the work. Filkins and Miller approached Ray in a manner that didn't spark suspicion. In a world where contraband was currency, drugs often passed hands quietly, and an inmate accepting a dose didn't turn heads. When the heroin was introduced into Ray's system, the two men watched him closely. The Brotherhood preferred methods that left fewer marks, and a drug overdose was as clean as it gets. For several tense minutes, Ray staggered, weakened, and began to slip into a haze. Filkins monitored his breathing, his posture, the slackness in his muscles, waiting, evaluating, anticipating the moment he would collapse for good. But Ray didn't die. The heroin hit him, but not fatally, not fast enough, not conclusively. His body struggled, resisted, clung to consciousness in a way that wasn't part of the plan. In that moment, the quiet calm that Filkins had worn like armor cracked just enough for urgency to slip through. This was the scenario the AB had prepared him for, the contingency that turned a silent poisoning into a hands-on execution. There could be no hesitation. If Ray recovered, if he cried out, if he drew attention, everything would collapse. Filkins, Miller, and every AB member involved would be thrown into jeopardy. The Brotherhood demanded certainty. Miller moved first, grabbing Ray and pinning him down with the force and precision expected of his role. It wasn't a chaotic struggle, but a controlled, deliberate maneuver to immobilize the target. Miller pushed Ray's shoulders, tightened his grip, and braced his weight to prevent Ray from thrashing or making noise. In the violent calculus of prison killings, the holder was just as essential as the killer himself. Without Miller's strength, Ray might have fought long enough to alert a guard or disrupt the operation. But Miller held firm, grounding Ray like an anchor as Filkins stepped forward. Filkins retrieved the garrote, a thin, lethal wire that had been fashioned with the specific intent of ending a man's life, quickly and silently. The wire was cold against his hands, the type of killing tool that carried no margin for error. He looped it around Ray's neck with the focus of a man who had been preparing for this moment for months. Ray struggled, his body still fighting the combined assault of heroin and suffocation, his limbs reacting instinctively to the terror bursting through his mind. But Filkins tightened the wire with both hands, leaning his weight into it, pulling with purpose and resolve. The violence was intimate, brutally close. Filkins felt Ray's final resistance as a physical sensation, muscles straining, breath cutting off, life slipping away inch by inch. This wasn't a swift motion. It was a sustained act that required commitment. In that span of seconds that felt like minutes, Filkins crossed the line the Brotherhood had drawn for him. He wasn't simply killing a man, he was severing the last tie between his old identity and the one the AB demanded. The garrote wire dug into Ray's skin, cutting through flesh as Filkins pulled, until the body beneath him went limp. The silence afterward was deafening. When it was done, Miller eased Ray's body to the ground, both men working with the unspoken understanding that they must make the scene appear as undisturbed as possible. In prison, even seconds mattered. The AB had orchestrated countless killings, and the cleanup, swift, quiet, controlled, was as much a part of the ritual as the killing itself. Filkins and Miller slipped back into the flow of inmates, blending in before guards could piece together what had just transpired behind closed doors. It was over. The hit had succeeded. Word traveled quickly but quietly through AB channels. Filkins had done what was asked of him. That same day, or soon after, depending on the version told by surviving members, he was presented with the Brotherhood's enduring symbol, a shamrock ring crafted in the prison's dental lab. To outsiders, the ring was a crude trinket. To members, it was a coronation. It was the sign that Filkins had shed the status of recruit and stepped into a lifetime bond sealed by murder. In that moment, Glenn G. Filkins became a full-fledged member of the Aryan Brotherhood. The blood-in had been completed, and the weight of the shamrock was now his to carry. What he didn't know, not yet, was that this killing would eventually become a key piece of evidence in one of the largest federal prosecutions ever launched against the AB. But for now, on that day in 1989, Filkins had earned what the Brotherhood valued above all else: trust through violence. In the months and years that followed the killing of Arva Ray, the world inside USP Lompoc changed in ways that neither Glenn G. Filkins nor the Aryan Brotherhood could fully anticipate. For the Brotherhood, the murder was another routine enforcement action, one more message sent, one more loose end tied off, one more initiation completed. But for federal investigators, it became a puzzle piece, a clue in a much larger pattern that would eventually expose the depth, organization, and brutality of the AB's operations across the nation's prisons. What Filkins had seen as a private rite of passage was, in reality, part of a growing body of evidence that prosecutors would use to target the gang with unprecedented force. Throughout the early 1990s, the federal government began shifting its strategy in dealing with prison gangs. Rather than treating murders as isolated incidents, investigators started connecting them, studying the codes, relationships, and hierarchies that shaped life behind the walls. They collected letters, monitored visits, flipped informants, and traced communications that moved from cell to cell like an invisible bloodstream. In this new investigative landscape, the Ray murder took on a different meaning. It was not simply an internal disciplinary matter, but a demonstration of the AB's ability to orchestrate killings with bureaucratic precision. It illustrated the gang's reliance on recruits, its internal structure, and its ritual of blood-in membership. Every detail made the gang look less like a loose association of white supremacist inmates and more like a criminal organization fit for federal prosecution under racketeering statutes. Filkins didn't fully grasp how much attention the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, and federal prosecutors were giving to these murders until agents began appearing more frequently at Lompoc and other federal facilities. Interviews were conducted in quiet rooms. Inmates were reclassified into higher security units. Rumors circulated that the government was preparing something massive, something designed not to punish one murderer at a time, but to dismantle the Aryan Brotherhood as an entire entity. For men like Filkins, who had carried out the orders of the Commission with complete loyalty, the possibility of facing consequences far beyond internal prison discipline was not part of the original calculation. The Brotherhood's ideology promised protection. Its structure promised unity. But even the AB couldn't shield its members from the federal government once the hammer finally dropped. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a sweeping federal case began to form. Task forces pieced together decades' worth of murders, assaults, conspiracies, narcotics trafficking, and extortion schemes. The AB's legacy of violence had finally caught up with it. Filkins found himself named among the many individuals targeted in massive indictments, a legal offensive designed to crack the gang's leadership like a shell. These indictments weren't mere documents, they were battle plans. Prosecutors sought the death penalty for several high-ranking members, including Barry the Baron Mills and Tyler the Hulk Bingham. Others faced life sentences. The government's message was clear. The AB would no longer operate with impunity. Filkins' role in the killing of Arva Ray was a major component of the prosecution's case. It illustrated the AB's internal discipline, the authority of the Commission, and the ritualistic nature of the gang's violence. It demonstrated in stark detail how a murder could be ordered from the top and executed by recruits who were eager to prove themselves. The precision of the hit, the involvement of multiple members, and the symbolic reward of the Shamrock Ring all fed into the narrative prosecutors used to argue that the AB was not just a gang, it was a criminal enterprise worthy of federal dismantling. As the trials progressed, the AB's structure began to fracture under the pressure. Some members cooperated with authorities, others held firm, adhering to the gang's code of silence even as they faced life sentences. The Commission's ability to issue orders became increasingly constrained as leaders were placed in highly restricted housing units where communication was limited. The government achieved what it had long sought. It disrupted the Brotherhood's command structure in ways that violence alone never could. And yet the AB did not vanish. Like many prison gangs, it adapted, decentralized, and continued operating with the resilience of an organization forged in decades of warfare behind bars. For Filkins, the legacy of the Ray murder became a defining thread in the tapestry of his life. What had once been a moment of ascension, a ritual meant to mark loyalty, strength, and brotherhood, had transformed into a legal burden that followed him through every courtroom appearance, every motion filed, every interview request from investigators. The act that granted him full membership in the Aryan Brotherhood became the act that tethered him permanently to the government's most aggressive prosecutions. He had stepped into the AB expecting a brotherhood bound by loyalty. Instead, he found himself entangled in a network of indictments that sought to dismantle the very world he had pledged to serve. In the broader history of the Aryan Brotherhood, the killing of Arva Ray stands as a reminder of the gang's internal logic, a world where every slight invites retribution, where loyalty is proven through murder, and where membership is sealed with irreversible decisions. It also stands as a symbol of the federal government's evolving approach to prison gangs, an era when isolated acts of violence were reinterpreted as pieces of a grand criminal puzzle. The Ray case helped push the AB further into the crosshairs of one of the most ambitious anti-gang prosecutions in American history. Today, the story of Glenn G. Filkins is woven into the larger narrative of how prison gangs operate, how they maintain control, and how far they will go to enforce loyalty. It is also a testament to how the consequences of a single act, planned in secrecy, executed with precision, and carried out in the name of brotherhood, can echo for decades. For Filkins, the murder was the moment he became a full-fledged member of the Aryan Brotherhood. For the government, it became the evidence they needed to strike back. And for history, it became yet another chapter in the grim, complex saga of power, violence, and survival inside America's most dangerous prisons.